So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Jacqueline Pitts. I am the Vice President of Communications and Marketing here at the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, filling in for our President and CEO, Ashley Watts, this morning. We are so excited to host this conversation with two incredible panelists about the recent infrastructure bill. So today we're hosting this conversation with Maurice Henderson, the Senior Advisor for Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and Transportation Cabinet Secretary here in Kentucky, Jim Gray. And we'll be discussing that federal infrastructure bill, which passed Congress with some bipartisan support and was signed by the president about a week ago. Now, as most of you know, the Chamber has been a very strong advocate for that infrastructure bill. And we want to thank Leader McConnell and Representative Yarmouth for their yes votes. Again, some bipartisan support there from Kentucky. We love to see that. And we thought it would be helpful to hear some about the bill, what's in it, and what it means not only for the US, but also for Kentucky. We know this is some historic investments that are being made. So we're excited to hear more about it. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Henderson to give an overview of the federal bill, and then we'll hear from Secretary Gray on how the bill will impact Kentucky. But let me give some introductions real quick. Maurice Henderson serves as a senior advisor in the Office of the Cabinet of the Secretary. And Henderson has also served in leadership roles both domestically and internationally in public and private sectors, as well as on a number of political and advocacy campaigns. Most recently, Henderson was Senior Director of U.S. Government Partnerships at transportation technology startup Bird Rides, Inc. And previously, he was a member of the Oregon Transportation Commission, North American Bike Share Association, Green Roads Foundation, and Fourth Mobility. And as you know, Jim Gray is no stranger to this audience. Secretary Gray has been the Transportation Secretary since the beginning of the Beshear administration, has been a business leader in our state, and has served as the mayor of Lexington. He's been a great friend of the chamber and an advocate on this issue. So Mr. Henderson, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you to go ahead and give us an overview on this legislation.
Great, thanks so much, Jacqueline. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and exciting times and happy holidays first and foremost, and hope everybody's families are safe and healthy. As Jacqueline mentioned, last week Monday, President Biden signed into law this historic piece of legislation, bipartisan infrastructure, now law. We're calling it the bill. It has gone through several names. That is a $1.2 trillion package that is focused on issues around climate and equity, issues related to the crumbling infrastructure that we see in too many places around the country. As you all probably know, the American Society of Civil Engineers does their annual report on America's infrastructure. Kentucky was a C- this year, so I think Secretary Gray, you and the team there, and the governor have been doing a great job of trying to just hold the line, keep the status quo. Other states were a little bit stronger. A lot of states were had lower grades. So the vision that the president and the congressional leadership, including a bipartisan set of senators and House members, including, as was mentioned, some of yours, including Leader McConnell, understood the importance and the generational impact of this bill. So just for some quick numbers, and I know that the secretary will give you a bit more on the impacts directly in Kentucky, and I can highlight a few of those myself. Overall, 1.2 trillion. 550 billion of that is new money that's going to be allocated out to states and localities and regions throughout the country. 110 billion of that is going towards highways, roads, and bridges. As I was mentioning, the American Society of Civil Engineers has been tracking this for a long time. I know in Kentucky, there's about, I believe it's 1,000 bridges and about 1,300 miles of highway that are rated in poor condition. So this money is going directly out to states again and localities to help address some of those issues. I believe you're on formula funding, looking at about 4.3 billion in money coming from FHWA based on traditional formulas for dollars, and another, I believe it's somewhere around 430 million for bridge repair and replacement for the state of Kentucky. And we are putting out fact sheets, so I'll make sure after this, if you haven't seen it, that the fact sheet for Kentucky, which sort of lays out some of the high level numbers that are available at this point or available to you and your membership. 66 billion, which is a historic investment in passenger rail and freight rail, is also in this package. This is the largest investment in Amtrak since its creation. That is to address some of the maintenance backlog, to expand lines. There's been a lot of talk about the potential for high-speed rail in the United States. A lot of projects out there for years have been waiting for a federal infusion, and this will be that opportunity. I should have also mentioned in that first tranche of money, there's also about $16 billion available for competitive grants for major projects, and another $12.5 billion for bridge projects of national and regional significance. There's also a $39 billion investment in transit, which is also the largest investment historically in transit. That, I believe, in Kentucky is measured in, I think it's $391 million is coming your way for public transit support. So as a former mayor, Secretary Gray, I know that's something you appreciate. I know as a former mayor's chief of staff and also a COO of a transit authority, hearing numbers like that are music to our ears. And I know that there are so many folks who are in Kentucky who are transit dependent, who rely on public transit. And so this infusion is going to be incredibly important for them as well. Part of that money, just for what it's worth, and I can talk a little bit more about the EV pieces, is for the ability to convert from diesel powered buses towards zero emission fleets, which we have seen happening across the country with different transit authorities. There's another 50 billion, as folks remember from earlier this year during the winter months. Our fellow Americans down in Texas were hit by those horrific storms. We saw people living in nearly third world conditions, folks having to fill their toilets up with snow and ice and things of that nature. The president wants to make sure that, and the Congress wanted to make sure that our infrastructure was hardened, resilient, prepared for some of the extreme weather situations. We know that you guys have been hit by some as well. And so there's a $50 billion investment to really to harden our infrastructure, to do some of the grounding that's necessary for power lines, et cetera. There's another really important tranche of money I wanted to discuss. I know that for folks who've been running your businesses from home, for folks who've been raising kids and trying to do that online, access to quality broadband has been a real challenge for too many Americans. I know that it's about 227,000 folks in Kentucky actually don't have access to broadband at all. And so the president, with the congressional leadership, made sure that funding for broadband was a major part of the package. So there's $65 billion in that package for broadband access, broadband expansion. But there's also a program for low-income families called the Affordability Connectivity Benefits. And so that will give an opportunity for families who have internet or broadband infrastructure nearby, but have not been in a position to actually pay for it. That will lower that cost for them and give them access to that great resource. Another incredibly important piece that the president's been focused on is the fact that 10 million households and 400,000 schools across the country lack access to clean drinking water, which should be just a fundamental right, and certainly for our communities and for our children. So there's $55 billion in this package to address lead pipes and things of that nature, to make sure that those households and those school districts can be sure that they have access to clean drinking water going forward. Another important investment, there's $25 billion for airports. So that is for airport modernization, that is for tower replacement and repair, that is for runway expansion and things of that nature. So for some of our smaller regional airports and even some of our larger international and municipal airports, this is going to be a huge infusion of dollars for them. It's one of the things that I'm really excited about as a former city DOT person as well, is the $11 billion for safety projects. So for the first time, we will have a Safe Streets for All program. So you think about things like safe routes to school, bike and pedestrian enhancements in our system. This $11 billion will be money that puts an incredible down payment, like the other dollars here, towards a more sustainable and safer vision for folks on our roadways. As all of you folks know, we still see close to 40,000 Americans die every year on our roadways, and that should just be something that is unacceptable in a first world country like the United States as a global and economic leader. The last two things I'll just mention quickly is the president's commitment to climate, along with the power grid and environmental remediation issues. There's $15 billion that's set aside for $7.5 billion of that is for an EV network expansion. I think you probably heard the number 500,000 EV chargers across the country. The president is very committed to seeing us move towards a cleaner future by 2030, seeing 50% reduction, and by 2050 having an economy that is completely zero emission based. So that 7.5 billion goes towards setting up that infrastructure across the country. State DOTs and regional partners will have access to those dollars to figure out how they can use them in public and private spaces. And then there's another $7.5 billion to go along with the money that I was talking about before with public transit investment towards the conversion of transit buses, school buses, and ferry services towards an electrified future. So all in all, there's an incredible amount of money here. That is an incredible down payment. Obviously, it does not solve every problem. It does not address every situation. But the president has been very clear that making sure that the climate and equity and that addressing our infrastructure challenges to make sure that we are competitive going further into the 21st century with global competition like China and others is something that is important for the American people. And I will pause there and turn to the secretary and Jacqueline.
Before we go to you, Secretary Gray, Mr. Henderson, I want to ask you something. You just listed a lot of different things that have to do with infrastructure. When we first think about infrastructure, we usually think of roads and bridges, but it's broadband, it's water, and it's all of these things you were talking about. But throughout this discussion, there's been a lot of chatter, if you will, about the bill having not a lot, more than just infrastructure in it. What do you say to that type of chatter?
Well, I think the important thing is that, this bill is going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs over a 5-year to 10-year period. These investments, like I said, are generational investments, pretty much once in a lifetime, probably for many of us, investments that we've been working hard in our circles to try to see happen. I think that at the end of the day, the fact that you saw 18 Senate Republicans and 13 House Republicans cross over in an incredibly partisan time, the understanding of the critical need to invest in our infrastructure is there. I mean, you don't have to look further than, what happened with your neighbors over in Tennessee with the bridge there. We remember a few years ago, the bridge collapse in Minneapolis. And, for those of us who are baseball fans, we remember watching that World Series in '89. So these are investments that are critically important for making sure that our nation, regardless of your political leanings, move forward. Because at the end of the day, it's an American economy. It's not a Republican or a Democratic economy. It's not a Republican or a Democratic environment. All of these investments are smart investments that will make sure that we continue to remain competitive, that we create jobs that are in many cases union friendly. And so that, our children grow up with an opportunity to continue to build upon the investments that we're making today.
Now, Secretary Gray, let's talk about the Kentucky impact. There's been a lot of talk about what this means for Kentucky. And that groups across the political spectrum have all supported infrastructure investment for a long time, and we're supportive of this bill. And there's been a lot of Brent Spence Bridge, I-69, Mountain Parkway. These are projects we've been talking about for a very, very long time. So does this bill make that possible for us? And is there anything that we need to do on the state side, including raising the gas tax, which is something that's been discussed for years, to meet these investments at the state level? You're muted, sorry.
I thought I was ready to go.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it, Maurice? Well, I wanted to, before I get into the answering that, you ask, are these opportunities? And I would say a monosyllabic answer, yes. No question that these represent opportunities. And Special Advisor Maurice Henderson, Maurice, you've done a great job of giving us this overview. I wish I could replicate it as well. Thank you so much. And I hope you will also thank Secretary Pete for sending you as his emissary today, and also thank Charles Small. Thank you all. Thanks
absolutely
to all of you for taking the time to be with us today.
Our pleasure.
You bet. So Jacqueline, yeah, a short answer on that is, and Maurice said it so well, that this represents a generational investment. I would actually translate it, and he used this language too. He said lifetime. I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. I've been in business. I've been in the construction industry pretty much all my life. I was a mayor for 8 years. And this level of opportunity, this level of investment is something that we haven't seen. Now, do we need to manage it well? Yes, of course we do. And in fact, it's been characterized as not shovel-ready projects, but shovel-worthy projects. That's what we're examining today, and what we're looking at, and what we're considering. And that's what we're doing right here at the Transportation Cabinet, our Department of Highways, for roads and bridges, and other projects throughout the cabinet, including transit, of course. When we think about shovel-worthy, we think not just projects that can be executed fast, but projects that can be executed smartly. So not just fast, but smart. And I think that's what Maurice has emphasized. That's what the secretary, that's what the president has emphasized. And let me say this, from the very beginning, Governor Beshear has been an advocate for this legislation from the very beginning. In fact, he's talked to the president more than one occasion, once in person. And you can imagine, Jacqueline, and everyone on this call, that he has been advocating for every dime, every dollar that Kentucky has a shot at earning, at winning. And that includes the grants. You mentioned the Brent Spence Bridge. You mentioned I-69. You mentioned the Mountain Parkway. These are front and center. These are his priorities. These are the governor's priorities, have been from the very beginning. We're making some headway on these projects. I-69, for the I-69 approach from the Henderson to Evansville, that bridge, but the approach to the bridge is being let, the contract for that will be let very soon. Bids are in, and the technical side of the proposals are being examined today. So we know that that's on target. Now, Maurice mentioned the $12.5 billion in the bridges of national significance. I believe that's the way it's characterized, isn't it, Maurice? Bridges of national economic significance. Well, as everyone on this call knows, the Brent Spence Bridge has been a poster child for that need, for just that need. I'm speculating, of course, when I say this, but I believe strongly that we have the best position in the country to win a grant within that category, within that pool of funds, that $12.5 billion. The good news too is that there are other buckets, there are other pools, there are other funds that are subject to competitive grants. We're good at this. We've already started our work on the grants, on the applications for these grants. We're not waiting. We did not wait until the IIJA was passed. We started work early. Now we've got to advocate as well as apply. And so we'll work with our legislative delegation. We'll work with our governor, will be advocating with Secretary Pete, with anybody, of course, that we can meet with. But we believe we've got a both bona fide project with Brent Spence and projects with our other major initiatives. Now let's put this in context for Kentucky. What does another $550 billion over 5 years represent for Kentucky? It represents somewhere between 100 and, well, actually for roads and bridges, and then the bridges component in addition, we'll be funding of a little more than 230, perhaps 230 million a year. And how does that translate into our current formula, our current program, our current federal highways funding? That translates into roughly a 30 to 35, maybe north of 35% in additional funding annually that we're going to achieve over the next few years. The hope is that that funding will continue, of course. That's been the history. That's been the precedent, that fundings at these levels will continue. This is what we need, because just think of it this way. We've got 64,000 lane miles of highway in Kentucky. We've got 9,000 bridges in Kentucky that have been characterized as, I'm sorry, let me fix that number. Sometimes these numbers, they all run together on us, don't they, Maurice? We've got almost 1,000 bridges between the state and counties that are characterized in fair to poor condition. We've got more than 9,000 miles of pavement characterized in fair to poor condition. Altogether, that represents a backlog of maintenance of almost $2 billion. So this legislation and this bill and this funding, while it is significant, it is not a cure-all, which takes us back to where the chamber has been advocating for increased revenues through our gasoline, through our vehicle, through our motor vehicle fuels tax, commonly called to and referred to as a gasoline tax. While you've been advocating for that, and that's recognized and certainly appreciated. Now, why is that important? Because we have to match on these grants. We have to match a minimum of 20%. So let's say a project like the Brent Spence is $3 billion, somewhere close in the estimate. I'm just saying, I'm saying a rough order of magnitude, $3 billion. All right, 20% of that's 600 million. Now that's split between Kentucky and Ohio. Won't go into all those numbers, but we have to come up with those funds. And in a competitive situation like these grants represent, some of our states, our competitor states, our sister states, our neighboring states even, will contribute more. Where they have more funds through their state revenues, they're going to be able to contribute more. This is something that we've still got to look at. I've said this is not a cure-all. It's not a panacea. Is it a significant, does it represent a significant lift? Absolutely, it represents a significant lift. And I think in that respect, we're all enormously supported. Now, Jacqueline, you ask about I-69, you ask about the Mountain Parkway. Yes, these projects, all of these projects represent opportunities for investment through this legislation, additional investment through this legislation, and additional opportunities through the grant programs. The grant programs overall, and Maurice, correct me where I'm wrong, but represent a much more robust in terms of dollars available. And so while we're planning to achieve increased revenues of somewhere in the 230 million annually, we're expecting these opportunities for the grants as well. I was listening to an NPR program this morning, and it was all about this infrastructure legislation. And the comments there were that, from a mayor on the West Coast, from the governor of Maine, we've been applying for what's called RAISE grants today and infra grants, and we've missed out. We're certainly hopeful that there's going to be more of those where they can be spread around, and there will be more opportunities for success by more of us who are in earnest need of this investment. So that's sort of a snapshot, shrink wrap version of where we are today, Jacqueline, as it relates to Kentucky. I did not talk about our opportunities in transit. Those are enormous. Having been a former mayor of a city, that represents, as Maurice said, really extraordinary opportunity. Our EV, our electric vehicle charging station opportunities, the way that that's going to translate. Broadband, enormous. We're already working with the American Rescue Plan broadband funds, but this represents just a significant boost over what we have seen. Transformative is a word that's often used. I don't think that that word can be used enough today to describe what this legislation represents. I said it earlier, more than anything I've seen in my lifetime, going back, and I don't go back all the way to the interstate highway system, but close. And before that, you know, we grew up reading in our history books about the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, that pulled us out of the devastation of the Great Depression. And when you look at this then today, when we look back and see, where would we be if we didn't have the interstate highway system? Okay, we'll look at broadband, for example, and say, this was the moment where we were able to push it to the limit, to really throttle forward. So Jacqueline, thanks again for having us. I don't know how much time we got. I didn't mean to wear it out. I want to thank Special Advisor Maurice Henderson again. I may have to call on him. I may have to call on you or ask you for another one of these, Maurice. You're good at it. Thank you, sir.
No, thank you for having me.
You've both been fantastic, and we are coming up on our 30-minute mark. As long as you gentlemen are open to it, I'd love to ask one more question and get something from each of you on it. And for anybody who has to jump off, I know that everyone's schedule is very busy, especially on this holiday week. Thank you for joining us. We're so happy that you took the time today. What a great crowd. And this is being recorded, so it will be pushed out on our social media pages and to our members after this is done. So if you have to jump off, we really appreciate you being here. But I'd love to hear from both of you about what comes next. Obviously, we're talking about huge investments on so many different areas. Secretary Gray, you're talking about us applying for the grants and how we need to come up with the match. So what does the next couple of months or the next year look like? And when can we expect to see these investments, actually really see what's going to come from them?
You want to start first?
Sure, I can do that. And as the secretary mentioned, you know, a lot of the investment is already transpiring, right? So last Friday, we announced the RAISE grants, the Rebuild American Infrastructure through Sustainability and Equity. That's $1 billion. I think the threshold is about 25 million per community, 100, no more than 100 million per state. So we're already seeing critical investments happening. FAA, FHWA, FTA have been making grant announcements already. So communities are already seeing benefits from the work that so many of your chambers have done throughout the years to make sure that the federal government is hearing you about the kinds of investments that are needed in communities. As far as the bill investments, that is something that, one, we want to spend some time, and the president has been laser beam focused on making sure that we hear from communities about the needs that they have. The formula funding piece is something that has been there, that's going to be a critical component and undergirding of how this works. So much of that will be familiar to state DOTs and regional MPOs. There's also going to be some efforts to really try to tweak the numbers around what localities get to see. A lot of those details are not worked out, and a lot of that is really to be discussed in the 90-day comment periods and the statutorily required listening sessions that we have, because we have a larger group of stakeholders at tables now that want to be participatory in shaping the way that investments happen in their communities. And we certainly, as this administration, we support that. And so we look forward to having conversations like this one. And Secretary, I appreciate the opportunity. I know myself and my colleagues would love an opportunity to come back and talk to other folks from Kentucky about the way that we can partner together and address some of those critical infrastructure needs, some of those longstanding issues that you've had. But Jacqueline, to answer your question, I think what Americans can feel confidently about is things are moving already. The infrastructure money is going to take a little bit more time, but there are already dollars in the system that are out there trying to make a difference on the ground today.
Jacqueline, I'll say from a point of view of having been in a role like this for almost 2 years, that I've been so impressed with the way that Federal Highways and U.S. Department of Transportation has actually gotten ahead of things. They have been prepared, fortunately, have been preparing for the adoption of this legislation for some time. Now, that doesn't mean they've been wasting time. That means that they've been ahead of the curve. And that's, for those of us those of you who are in the business community day to day, that is reassuring. because there's not a moment that's lost. I sometimes say, and I'm going to just say this quickly, Jacqueline, I sometimes say that having been both in the private sector and the public sector is highly underrated, and a lot of folks in the public sector are highly underrated for their skills. I've been on both sides of it. I've seen some of the most talented people in my career in the public sector, and those are the people that are working today for these projects on behalf of our state. And for that, I think we should all be thankful, in especially a week like we're going, especially the week of Thanksgiving. We can be thankful for many things, of course, and this is one of those.
Just real quick before we wrap up, we did have a question in the chat that I addressed. Someone asked about what happens if we don't come up with the 25% match as a state or a locality. What happens? Does that money go to a different state? Secretary Gray, can you speak to that at the state level?
Well, what we're doing is we are applying for these. If the question's related to the grants, then we'll apply for the grants with the resources that we have. If we had more resources, we might be able to apply for more grant funding. That's what I meant by we're in a competitive situation with our neighboring states, and our states, not just neighboring states, but our states across the country.
Perfect. I think that was a great clarification. And I know we could do this all day long, but we did have this slated for 30 minutes. So I really do appreciate both of you gentlemen joining us today. Secretary Gray, always great to see you. Mr. Henderson, really appreciated overview. And this is an issue that the Kentucky Chamber obviously is going to follow and continue to inform you guys on as our members, as the business community. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Kate or Ashley, and we will get you answers from these two gentlemen. So happy Thanksgiving week, everyone. Again, what a great turnout on a holiday week. We really appreciate you all joining us. And thank you again to Secretary Gray and Senior Advisor, Mr. Henderson.
Thank you. Happy holidays. Take care.
Thanks.
Have a great day, everyone.